The Andrews has been a long-term ecological research site, as well as being an U.S. Forest Service experimental forest for a number of years. And part of being an LTR, long-term ecological research, is that we do put our data online and share the data fairly openly. We began this project called StreamChem DB for database because we realized that the Andrews could be very comparable to other sites across the country. A lot of the other experimental forests have very long chemistry records too. The Andrews isn't the oldest. One, for example, in the Northeast, called Hubbard Brook, has been doing chemistry since the early 60s. Another, Coweta in North Carolina, has been doing it since the late 60s. And so we had all been doing these measurements, but hadn't really been cross-talking. Everyone was just focusing on their own measurements and putting their own papers out. But it was interesting that we did have very similar studies that were started back in the 60s, where the early scientists were measuring before and after clear-cutting harvest. And so one basin was not treated, and one basin was clear-cut, and had chemistry before and after. And so we have very comparable measurements, but we just hadn't talked across the country in terms of, well, we saw this, and how long did it last, and what did it mean, and how long did it take to recover back to pre-harvest levels. We got this funding through the ARRA and have been able to hire several folks to really pull together these databases as well. We had two purposes with this ARRA funding. One was to create the database and be able to archive that so as the personnel changes, the data is still usable. The other purpose, though, as a scientist, my first interest is looking at the data and analyzing it. And so by being able to have a postdoc and bring these collaborators together, we've been able to start by looking at, for example, trends over time. Are we seeing climate change effects across the country at these experimental forests in the stream chemistry? And then the next question is, what does it mean for our water yield in terms of chemistry and our nutrient yields coming out of these experimental forests? Another question is, what about disturbances? These clear cuts that I mentioned, these old treatments, have we seen the same response? Can we make some generalizations that then are usable by the managers in thinking about forest harvest or forest treatments and what it means for how long there's an increase in nutrients coming out of these basins and how quickly they recover? And we haven't always seen the same responses. It's kind of surprising when we start looking at it. It's not just, oh yeah, the first year it's twice as high and then it goes down to half as high in 5 years. It's much more, there really are some site-specific characteristics that then help us understand what goes on in those sites.
My name is Greg Downing. I'm a hydrologic technician for the Forest Service. I work for the Pacific Northwest Research Station out of Corvallis, but I do most of my field work up here at the Andrews Experimental Forest. And most of that work is focused on taking care of the 9 stream gauging stations that we have scattered around on the Lookout Creek watershed. The gauging stations, you can't just leave them alone, especially at this time of year. We get flows come through and sediment gets deposited in places that can impact the stream flow. And so we need to be there to clean it up, get the sediment out of there so we can make sure our measurements are as accurate as they can be.
When other agencies have been able to put their data online, they haven't necessarily had these long-term databases and questions to document. So USGS and EPA and the states have some stream chemistry data online, but it's sometimes hard to use because you don't know exactly where the site was, you don't know how it was measured, what the instruments were, you don't know the detection limits. There's some specifics about chemistry that are really important to know if you're going to try and do these cross-site comparisons or even do a long-term time series comparison.
So samples come in, big cart, we get them, weigh the total sample aliquot. Here's kind of where we enter the meat of all the information regarding pretty much each bottle that comes in.
The stream chemistry that's coming out of these experimental forests is real high quality water. So it's not like it's impaired water at this point. So how do you get people hooked about good quality water? The Andrews is one of the headwaters of the city of Eugene drinking water, and other experimental forests often have downstream drinking water uses. So having people think about, well, what is it I'm drinking? Another question is, what about disturbances? These clear cuts that I mentioned, these old treatments, have we seen the same response here in North Carolina and New Hampshire, for example, and West Virginia? Can we make some generalizations that then are usable by the managers in thinking about forest harvest or forest treatments and what it means for how long there's an increase in nutrients coming out of these basins and how quickly they recover? Constantly asking ourselves, is this, what's a question we're asking now, and how can we do it in a way that might be useful for the future, but we don't know. And the climate change questions, who would have known that we would have been wanting to look back and think about these kinds of references and stuff over time? It's a new use. I'm Sherry Johnson. I'm a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station. I'm the lead scientist for the Andrews Experimental Forest, a Forest Service scientist, and I'm also courtesy faculty at OSU Fisheries and Wildlife Department.